Well, I think we can start. And well, hello and welcome. My name is François Kivigier. I'm very happy to welcome you to the fourth session of Renaissance Lives. And today we are discussing Desiderius Erasmus, 1466-1536, to give you dates, with William Barker, who recently published the book Erasmus, the Spirit of a Scholar, and Misha Lazarus from the Faculty of English of the University of Cambridge. We will talk for about an hour, and then there will be half an hour open to you, the audience, to ask a question. But very briefly, to come back to our main subject, Erasmus. Erasmus was perhaps one of the most influential figures of his time, if not of all time. His translations and editions of the New Testament and of the text of the Church Fathers are vital to understand the Reformation, and as such, they have changed the face of Western religion, or at least considerably contributed. His work on Proverbs and his editions of classical texts, Greek and Latin, are very important relays in the transmission of the classical tradition. His impact on education is considerable, and even more to his credit, he was also an outstanding satirist, endowed with one of the most essential and powerful senses of all, the sense of humor. And perhaps some of these remain in the light smirk that you can see in this portrait by Holbein at the National Gallery. It is in fact the picture on which Bill Barker's book concludes, and the picture on which we thought we would start the conversation. So I leave it to you, Misha, to ask the first question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, François, and thank you for arranging this wonderful evening. Bill, as we can see here, we've got this wonderful portrait by Holbein with which you finish the book with a beautiful sort of coda of you standing in the National Portrait Gallery, or the National Gallery, seeing this portrait and considering what Erasmus really means today. So why don't you start by telling us a little about how the sight of this portrait and what's in the portrait led for you to the desire to write this book and the impulse that the portrait gave it?
Well, I was sort of casting around. I knew I was going to write the book because the publisher had approached me, and then I had written back a proposal and so on. And but it was really when I took a trip in my near the beginning of this, and decided to go to a few places where Erasmus had been in order just to get a sense of physical location. So I went to Anderlecht, to the little museum there. I went to Basel, and I also spent some time in London before I headed off on that continental trip to just look at this portrait. And I spent about an hour and a half in front of it trying to figure it out. And for about the first half hour, I just looked at it and tried to read it myself. But then I had my iPad with me, and on it was a remarkable article by William Heckscher describing this portrait and actually telling you all kinds of interesting things about it, which sort of opened it up for me. And at that point, I realized what I was looking at was something that was both in itself of interest, but also that demanded something from me to respond to this. And the way you respond, I think, to Erasmus is really through the texts, through the writing. And I'll get to that in a minute. But what I see there is, first of all, the title of the book, which is written on its on the edge there, down at the bottom. And what you have is on that is the Greek Herakuloi Ponoi and the labors of Hercules. And it's in some way, it's the title of the book that's there, but also, I believe, a title for the picture. It's a statement about the relationship of Hercules, who's actually got his gentle little hands on the book. And just a few minutes ago, we were talking about how much you received an MA degree from Arnold Schwarzenegger, who would be the modern equivalent of Hercules. And Erasmus, as you can tell, is no Hercules. And the hands especially, and there's a preliminary drawing of the hands by Erasmus in the Louvre. And they show how kind of sensitive he is touching this book. And also you get a sense of his personal accomplishment because of the clothing he's wearing. It seems very rich, you know, the fur there on faced inwards and also outwards, kind of a sign of his success. And then the location of it, which has classical pillars in the background, and off in the corner, a few little knickknacks, which if you read the hecture, you realize actually you can't even see them when you're in the gallery. It's actually, you can't get close enough, but a little message from Holbein telling people, don't you dare imitate this picture. Anyway, I think for the Labors of Hercules, it looks as though that's supposed to be a one book, but I think in this case it refers, some people say it's just the adages it refers to, and other people will say, oh, it's the Jerome edition or whatever, but for me, it's all of the books, and that's over 200 books. He never stopped once he got going, and we'll talk a bit about that, how he got going. But so and also that the massive correspondence, over 3,000 letters, close to 700 correspondence, extremely complicated and often contradictory figure, and a great reviser of his own work. So he would continuously revise and usually expand if he was revising. I don't think there's any book that got any shorter when he revised, but he's usually adding something, you know, an index here or a new letter at the beginning or whatever. And my problem with Erasmus was partly the volume of things, but also the elaborate way in which he kind of concealed himself yet presented himself in his own writing. And one of my cues for this was Martin Luther, who had many nasty ways of describing Erasmus, but one of them was as an eel, and kind of slippery, hard to pin down individual. And so the question is how to grasp the eel. And in one of the adages, it tells you how to do this. You take a fig leaf, which has got a rough surface on it, and you reach down into the water and you snatch up the eel, and you can hold it that way. And so my question is, what is the fig leaf? What are we going to use to capture Erasmus if we're trying to do that, to try and hold him still for a moment? And I actually wrote Arnoud Visser about this, because in Utrecht, he had written an article on this, and his conclusion was it was really his Christian humanism, the philosophy of Christ, that was the one thing that you can sort of get down to the core of Erasmus's. But Erasmus's religion, to me, is not a very personal kind of religion, and that's something I might want to talk about too. So anyway, behind the book, I'm now retired, but during my time, I could see fascinating shifts in the cultural world and in the world of the university. And when I started my education, certain things were prized. For instance, a knowledge of a known canon of texts, and of those texts, not least the Bible, and a knowledge of ancient languages, and a broad knowledge of history, and so on. But now I would say that has been swept away in the present day university. There's still a lot of people who do that kind of work, but it's now been increasingly marginalized. And what I'm trying to figure out with Erasmus is what this means to a figure like Erasmus, who, you know, in 1973, Erasmus was still pretty famous, in the sense that his when they put together the Erasmus of Rotterdam University in Rotterdam, which is basically technical schools, which they put together, and they used his name as the one that they would. So obviously a symbolic figure at that time. and for the Erasmus exchange among European schools. It's also a major figure used to describe someone who's kind of pan-European, which Erasmus was. And even now you can take something called the Erasmus line in Brussels, in the subway, and it takes you out to a final station. And actually, because I visited this in the station, where it was decorated with quotations from the adages, which I thought was rather clever. And so a major figure in a way, but standing for something. But I don't think we'd be using the name Erasmus now in the way that it was used even just a few decades ago.
Yeah.
And something has happened. And you may be aware of that too, in what you've seen.
Yes, well, yes, over a shorter period, but certainly I can see the change. A lot of the scholarship on Erasmus that one reads was, of course, written in that period. So it's representing the sense that the name Erasmus is a byword for something. And I think that was probably true at the time too. I mean, you point out the frankly spectacular statistic that Erasmus at one point accounted for about 5% of book sales across Europe. I mean, that's an equivalent to that would only be something like, Seamus Heaney's dominance of the poetry book market. I mean, it really is that this was a figure who straddled his field. And I think something I got from reading the book in particular was that you point out that the biography of Erasmus is also very much about the origins. It's an origin story for the tradition of the humanities as we know them. I mean, does it actually make sense? Do the terms that we use make sense to transpose back to that time? Does it make sense to think of Erasmus as what we might think of as a public intellectual?
Yeah, I think that's when you begin to see such a thing actually emerge. And it's because of the printing press that is actually able to happen. And it's also at the time because of the use of Latin, which was moved across all the countries, even though the vernaculars were very much in place. And so I think that, yes, that's it. He takes on the role, what we would call a public intellectual. And but I don't know if he would have known what that was if you actually tried it out on him.
No, well, he was sort of inventing it as he went along, I think.
Yes, well, that's the other thing. There was a lot of inventing that happened in his life, a lot of creation of things. And so anyway, in my attempt to figure things out, I was really guided by actually one motto that he has on this coin here, which was made in 1519 for him by Quentin Metzis. And it's over on the left there. Ora telos macroboiou, and then mors ultimi. Oh, that's on the verso of that. But on the obverse, you've got tain crito ta syngrammata dexe. And so what you're looking at is how are you going to find out about him? And you're going to find out about him through his writings. His writings will show him better than any picture. So it doesn't mean we toss out the portraits by, Metzis, Dürer, and Holbein, but he is signaling to us that it's actually in the printed word and in his own writings that survive after him that you actually can discover something. And that's where I got the subtitle of the book, The Spirit of a Scholar. There is some kind of spirit essence, if you want to call it there, that's created. It's a fictional thing. It's something that can happen in language, that you get the sense of the words creating a personality. The image itself it was classical. Ovid uses it, and but it has a very special meaning for Erasmus. And he talks about this, for instance, in his biography of Saint Jerome at the beginning of his section of that edition. And there he talks about how Jerome, you're really only going to get to know Jerome through his writing. And in other places he will say, you cannot, if you're trying to read Cicero, for instance, or you're trying to find out about Cicero, who he really was, you're going to find out more about Cicero from reading him than you ever will by ever having had a conversation with him. And it's partly because you can go back and reread, not just read. So those are some of the kinds of themes that I was looking at in the book, and the way that Erasmus is really was formative in a kind of curriculum that was already in play, but became stabilized really at his time and after. And we're going to talk a bit about that in England, but it's in other countries too, and even into the Catholic countries, where even though he was banned, and I think we're touching on that also, he still snuck his way in there through things like the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum, where the preliminary curriculum is all really very similar to the Erasmus model of education, of a kind of classical text that you find in the I have to use some of the titles here, but the De Ratione, and other works like that. So.
Yeah, the De Ratione Studi, which he wrote for John Colet when he came to England on his, I think, third visit to England, when Colet was just setting up a public school at St. Paul's. And I think, as you say, it wasn't really the content of this curriculum so much as the mode in which he presented it and the teaching strategies that he proposed. I think you write about this very beautifully. I mean, summed up, it was very much about reading texts whole rather than textbooks which chopped up individual pieces of writing into little pieces. It was focused on getting the best language by reading the best authors. And he also says that the teacher, even of young boys, has to be really universally learned, a real philolog, familiar with what Erasmus calls the encyclopedia. Yes. I think one really extraordinary thing that comes through very strongly in the biography is that for somebody who claimed that he was shown better in his writings, he considered himself old, basically, by the time he started publishing. I mean, there's a whole chunk of Erasmus's life, which I imagine must be quite difficult to write about, because it is really before his publishing career takes off.
Well, the interesting thing is you're quite right. I found that the interesting story happens during the years in which we have less information. So if you look at Percy Allen's edition, the first volume has all the interesting years in it. And then, I mean, it's still interesting after that, but it's the struggle that you find in the early years. And so up until really, I find until his trip to England, I think the trip to England that he took in 1500. So he would have been about 34 at that point, 35. And it was the invitation of Lord Mountjoy, who was a pupil of his. He went there and suddenly found himself welcomed by a community, a true community of scholars that were there. So Linacre, Grocyn, and other writers, and Colet and Moore. And he got to know these people. And I think their interest in him generated a kind of a sudden realization that he could actually participate as a kind of full member of a humanist community. And immediately after that, he started in on writing his, or basically preparing his book on the adages, which he'd already collected for students before that. But that was what really got him going. And I think the relationship with England, I mean, Archbishop Warham was his greatest patron and so on. And his friendship with Moore was one of the key aspects of his personal life, although sometimes they didn't correspond for long periods, but certainly there was a great friendship between them. That was the thing that there's a place where you could see how Erasmus kind of took to it. And he didn't really like he was in Cambridge for a while, and he didn't really enjoy that too much. But nevertheless, it was that's really transitional point, I think. And the friendship with Moore, translating Lucian together with Moore, and then going on to each publish books for each other. So the Praise of Folly, with a little pun of Moore's name in the cover and in the title, and also with Moore, and then also, of course, with helping Moore's book, The Utopia, getting published in Antwerp. So that kind of thing is really is very interesting to see how all that took place.
Yeah, it'd be great to stay with England for a moment, and just to contextualize this for some people in the audience. I mean, you can read in the biography how transformational for Erasmus these visits to England were. You know, the first visit, as you said, was in 1499. He's aged 34, and he sort of finds an intellectual community. And Erasmus is someone in particular who keeps coming back to this notion of intellectual community, which we'll talk about, I think, a little later. He's 34, he comes to England, and a light really switches on. He writes letters later in his life. This is a letter in 1517 that he writes to Latimer. He's saying that with Linacre, Tunstall, or Latimer as teachers, you know, a scholar like Erasmus would not even feel the need for Italy. And Italy at this, I mean, we read that quite neutrally now, perhaps, but I mean, Italy at this time is the absolute center of humanist learning. I mean, it's the place from which the Renaissance issued forth, and has a very strong cultural claim to learning. But Erasmus is finding this community north, and perhaps he sees an opportunity to refound it on a different basis or on his own basis. Do you think there's a kind of north-south divide there?
Well, there certainly is, because when he goes to, I mean, he really wanted to go to Italy back in 1493 when he signed on with a bishop who we thought was going to be made a cardinal and they'd get to go to Rome. So he was able to get there finally, and the trip was 1506 to, what was it? Yeah, so he was heading down there, and that was truly transitional for him. Not really at the beginning stages, because he was really tutoring these boys he was taking around with him too. But when he finally broke off from them and had finally connected with Aldus Manutius, and that was one of his, when we talk about community, that was really a second introduction to a kind of community, which is a very intact group of scholars in Venice, all of whom were interested in the project of this expansion of the adages, and to be working with a printer who was in himself very learned and who would be correcting proofs and helping to guide the thing through, and with other scholars around providing manuscripts and so on, that was another one of these moments in which a big transitional moment for him. And also to realize that he was going up head to head with the stars of humanities, humanistic studies in Italy. And so finally to finish this book and have it acclaimed as it was afterwards meant that he had gone there and succeeded. And up in the north, he was then, soon after, it was 1514 really, I guess, by then he's proclaimed the Prince of Humanists. Yeah. When he goes to visit up in Germany, up and towards Basel. And when he's called that, that the magic has happened and the transition has occurred. And it really happened while he was in Italy, even though I think the thing that gave him the confidence was being in England and then starting his writing after that, and the preparation of the editions and so on that he did, like Cicero and so on. And also writing his Enchiridion, which was his first attempt at doing a kind of theological writing.
Yes, and I think, again, it's hard to emphasize enough the reciprocal impact of Erasmus on England. I think England turned Erasmus onto Greek partly. Oh, yeah. And he started a lot of his he started a lot of his biggest projects there while he was at Cambridge between about 1509 and 1514. But I would add also, from the English perspective, Erasmus came, he was at Cambridge, he was teaching undergraduates, some of them were acting as his scribes. Two of those students became the very first formal lecturers in Greek in England. So the Erasmian impact on English education, on English scholarly and intellectual culture is felt really almost immediately, just 4 years after Erasmus leaves on that trip, John Bryan, Thomas Lupset, I mean, these are, of course, names that are even less remembered in public discourse today than Erasmus's is, considerably less. But we do still see the evidence of it. Corpus Christi College, Oxford, of course, which was an early, hugely important center of humanist learning in Oxford, in England, was founded in 1517, very much on an Erasmian basis. Several of Erasmus's students went down to Italy to edit some of the most important Greek medical texts of the century. And actually, I recall that Lisa Jardine, I think, analyzed a lot of student book lists from Cambridge and showed that there were actually more of Erasmus's works on the undergraduate curriculum than there were works by Aristotle or Cicero. Students, undergraduate students, were reading the paraphrases, the handbook of a Christian soldier, the Enchiridion, as you said, the adages, they were reading his books on style. It's very hard, I think, to imagine a single figure with such a universal impact on the educational culture of an entire country. I mean, did that proceed into the later 16th century as well, after Erasmus had passed away in the 1530s?
Yeah, before I start in on that, I just want to add one more name to it because I found it fascinating. Stephen Gardiner, who became the Lord Chancellor, Erasmus remembered him for the quality of the salads that he made as a kind of a hanger-on in the early days. So there are these odd kind of connections that were created at that time. I think where you really see the impact of Erasmus in England later is there was a lot of translation up to around 1580 of individual works, but then after that, I think by then the curriculum of the schools, which were really set on a kind of St. Paul's model that Erasmus had been so involved in, and using that same kind of method that we talked about earlier, that curriculum really had an amazing impact in England in the later half of the 16th century. In my own theory, I spent most of my early time studying on English education. And so I was quite, Erasmus really made sense in that context. But the impact of that was to create a not just people who had gone through the schools but never made it to university, like William Shakespeare or Ben Jonson, one who had small Latin and less Greek, and the other one had quite a lot of it, that you got from William Camden. And what you have, though, is not only those writers, but also the readers and the people going to the plays and the people reading the literature and so on. There is a kind of a base level of education which was really shot up in the last quarter of the 16th century in England. And I think that the whole literary community that you have, all people who are writing and reading, were all came out of this kind of educational thing that was very, to my view, quite Erasmian in its quality and the way that it proceeded. And you also see it in the, in the writers, very particular examples in people's writing. They picked up little things like Spencer, and even Shakespeare has odd things that you find in the plays that look like they may have actually come out of Erasmus somewhere, but they may have just been passed on orally, or they may have been picked up some other way. But it is quite unusual, the sense you have of that, but you don't actually have the particulars of that. Although talking about textbook or student handbooks, I know when a few years ago Margot Todd wrote on this, and it was a study of the notebooks that students kept in Oxford and Cambridge up from late 16th, early 17th century. And there again, Erasmus was very much in play. People reading, proposing that other people read, and so on. Enough to say that he was still, a figure of interest. Gabriel Harvey annotated the Parabolae and things like that. That people were engaged with that, with the texts.
And I would add to that, actually, it wasn't just Erasmus's writings themselves that were of continuing educational interest. There was also a sort of Amazon recommendation system that was working as well. I mean, if Erasmus had translated a text, that text was featured on the front page of all of the booksellers' catalogs that you could find. You know, you can really chart, I think, a course through, for example, the reading of tragedy, Greek tragedy, that is, in the 16th century, and you will find that people who are reading more of Aristotle tend to like Sophocles, but people who are reading more of Erasmus tend to like Euripides, because Erasmus had translated some plays of Euripides. So there are whole traditions stretching over the entire century, I think, that really have their seed in Erasmus and his recommendations and his literary taste. I think it became a sort of question of how to be a learned and literary person on the model of Erasmus. Well, so far, this has all been a very positive story, but of course there was a more difficult side to Erasmus's life, and that started to develop, I think, after the beginnings of, well, indeed.
Who put that picture up there?
Yes, the imposing figure. And, you know, even at Cambridge, Erasmus actually wrote to a student that a Cambridge college, which was steeped in theology, we don't know which one he was referring to, had actually banned his copy of the New Testament, then called the Novum Instrumentum, from the college grounds. It had banned the import of Erasmus's copy of the Greek New Testament by horse, boat, wagon, or porter. So they just couldn't get the book in there any way that was possible. I mean, why don't you tell us first, I think, about the roots of this disagreement, and then perhaps we can talk about, well, just why or how it got so extreme.
Well, I think that there's several disagreements that we're going to have to look at, and one is the Erasmus's struggle with scholasticism, which he found incredibly difficult to study. And I'm kind of sympathetic. I guess I'm more of a rhetorician than a logician, but so in the 1490s, when he's in Paris, he has very amusing descriptions of being at lectures, or you know, ways of rejecting that scholastic model, even though later on he, you know, was willing to, with his theological writing, use Aquinas and other writers. But early on, it was just it was a complete rejection, and that got into his writing also. The more satirical early writings, up to, this is before the Louvain and places like that where he moved to, but he was seen as a figure of some suspicion once he got going, because of this anti-scholastic thing. And for instance, in the Enchiridion, the handbook on the Christian soldier that he wrote early on, that has a, I mean, he does not mention one medieval author in there. It just jumps over, you know, goes from antiquity, and then suddenly it's as though something is seriously missing there for a contemporary. And when he moves to, I guess after the New Testament, that's when the troubles really began, but it was also present there in the Praise of Folly and places like that, the anti-scholastic thing. But then you have these different theology schools, like at Louvain, and then Paris, and then in Spain and in Italy too, rejecting the works, and a kind of a censorship starts up, because it was cancel culture back then as well as today, and you just didn't have it, you know, you just didn't have it around. And so when we get to Luther, however, it's a different story, because Luther, of course, is, although well trained in scholastic philosophy, he was a very good student of that. He had real issues with the church, his church, and the way that the management from Rome was coming. And then there was this breakaway that he began, and actually began with in a friendly way with Erasmus, but it was very quick that the two parted paths. Luther didn't really trust Erasmus. I think it was partly his Erasmus's irony, although Luther could be pretty ironic himself. But it was that, and also the sense that Erasmus was somehow too secular, not enough of a strong believer. He was and he mentions this in a number of places in the Table Talk and elsewhere, that Erasmus was an Epicurean. Later on, Erasmus is an Epicurean. He was all kinds of bad things, and but that was just after when they actually got into their direct fight, which is in the 1524 with the Erasmus was finally convinced to write against Luther. He always had respect for Luther, or for aspects of the Lutheran cause, but he felt Luther had gone too far. And so he chose an area that caught everyone a bit by surprise, and that is the issue of free will, which was only one of the many things that was Luther was being critiqued for, his rejection of any kind of free will in the terms of self-determination of a Christian, that you can, through prayer, through purchasing your way for salvation in some senses, with indulgences and so on, that he was. So then with Erasmus's book on free will and Luther's response, the whole thing goes into direct conflict. And at that point, there is a complete and total break, and also with many of the followers of each one of them. And so you've got now two things that Erasmus has to deal with: the Catholic antagonism and then the Protestant antagonism. So he described himself as being like in a Trojan War over 20 years. But he was fighting two wars. Yeah. So in my book, I mentioned Achilles only had to have one opponent, or Hector only had one opponent. Erasmus had two all during that time. And so it's, and that's when things got super complicated in terms of his allegiance, people's allegiance to him and what he was doing, because people had trouble accepting that from a Catholic point of view, that he actually approved of certain things that Luther had done. And on the other hand, from the Protestant point of view, that he remained loyal to his church. And so the battle went on from there. And it's, there are many different conflagrations in the way this occurred over time.
Yeah, I think I'd like to come back actually to the theology underneath it, this, and Erasmus's sort of reluctant decision eventually to participate in full-throated theological debate. But it almost seems, especially with what you describe as the rapidity with which this animosity suddenly sparked up. These men weren't necessarily that far apart. I think they were pulling in different directions, but they weren't that far apart. My question was always, why so hot? And, I wonder whether we've talked about Erasmus's construction of a sort of cult of personality in print. And it does strike me that of all the figures at this time, the only one who could really compete with Luther in terms of somebody who is building a cult of personality in print is Erasmus. There's Andrew Pettigree's recent biography of Luther. It's called Brand Luther.
Yeah.
It was a function of branding, and it reminds me of exactly Heraklioi Ponoi, the labors of Hercules. This is also Erasmus, branding himself as the performer of intellectual labor, as the judge in many ways of intellectual accomplishment. Erasmus modeled a kind of relationship of deep scholarship to cultural commonplacing. He was accessible. He made so much of this learning accessible and easy to digest. And I wonder whether there was a sort of jostling at the top, really, for Luther, whether he saw Erasmus, somebody who wasn't wholly on side, but somebody who also had the power to command a lot of lay agreement.
I think I was absolutely stunned by the rapidity at which all of this happens. You know, it's almost 21st century speed of exchanges and so on. And because Luther was really, before the 95 Theses, was not really a major figure, and suddenly it just erupted. And I felt that Luther, as time proceeded, became more and more confident about what he was doing. It's as though he had to be challenged in order to take his positions. And the more people challenged him, the more he figured out where he really was. So it's like, and it's a sort of the same thing that happened with, in an entirely different way, with Erasmus when he wrote Praise of Folly. I think that he wrote that book not knowing where it was going. And I think it took him a place where he wasn't able to predict, and which is that everyone is a fool, including myself. And but that even a Christian, a deeply believing Christian, is a fool. That you get these people who are, they're trapped in a way by the logic of their behavior or their thinking, and it carries them so far that it races them past the point that they thought they were heading for. And I really sensed that with Luther as I was reading and trying to follow the stages of his changes, because it seemed as soon as he was locked away somewhere, as soon as someone tried to stop him at something, he pushed on further. And so I feel that there is that aspect of the thing in some of the scholarly debates that Luther had of there's only room for, that Erasmus had, there's only some room at the top. I talk about that in my book. It's a wonderful article by Randall Collins on academic arguments. And
exactly that.
And there is only so much room at the top. And Erasmus had captured that space for sure.
Yes, you call it
but I think it was in his scholarship and not necessarily in his theology. And that was because he was really, he'd started off, he was very pleased with, he comments in his, the book on, the Lorenzo Valla book on the Old Testament, which he found the manuscript for. He comments in that he's, where am I going with this? I can't remember what my point is. I'm sorry. But
it was precisely.
It'll come back to me in a second or two.
I'm sure it always
does. Anyway, there is this idea of only so much room, and so for scholarship, for scholarly debates, which he was willing to have with people, that was part of it. I'm sure that he was defending his now superior spot. But I think with some of the deeper theological things like Luther, it's more it's not really sort of defending Brand Erasmus to some degree, so we won't look foolish. But I think he's still inquiring as he does this.
Of course, Erasmus, it was an extraordinary position to be in, both to be lambasted by Luther and also find himself censored and ultimately on the Catholic index of prohibited books, equally reviled by both sides. One case in which the enemy of my enemy is in fact not my friend.
Right. That whole change was started with these earlier debates and rejections certainly turned into, when you get to the Council of Trent, into a complete rejection. But that's where I think we want Francois to speak.
Yes, I was going to.
Yes, well, that was really a question, because it's quite paradoxical that one of the most published authors of the 16th century is also one of the most censored from I think the first index of around 1547 is there constantly. And I understand also that these indexes are republished in Protestant countries because it's also advertisement for the stuff that can be read. But my feeling is that had he only focused on classical texts and not meddled with the New Testament and patristic literature, he would have been completely all right. But basically, the Protestants saw him as one of them, but he didn't see the Protestant as, he didn't see himself as one of them. But the Catholic obviously saw him as a Protestant. And I think it starts already in the 1520s in Valladolid, when the Spaniards make a council to look at Erasmus' work and understand it very much in syntony with the Protestant world.
Yeah, I felt that with the that the harder they pushed against the books later on, the more he became a Protestant author. Against Erasmus was a little bit surprised to see himself co-opted that way, but because I know that with the censorship by 1560s, they had kind of relented a little bit. They let a little bit of it in, but all of the dangerous books like The Praise of Folly and the Colloquies and so on were still to be banned completely. But with the Adages, it was such a valuable book, they somehow couldn't do without it. So a kind of compromise was set, and that's why you see so many of those early editions, or sort of so many editions with crossed out sections in the Adages, because that was one of the ones that was allowed to stay on the shelves, where it's only on condition that you cross out the offensive sections. And so some of them are beautifully censored, and others are rather crudely done. But it was quite a response to later on. But I do feel that by the end of the century, Erasmus we were talking about Erasmus in England. Erasmus has really got a foothold in England, but he does not in his own Roman Catholic world.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Quite interesting shift.
As time is pressing on, so I actually want to turn to, if we could, a different aspect that I thought was one of the most, well, to me, reading it, one of the more surprising and fascinating aspects of the biography you've written, which is about Erasmus's focus on health and the body and even bodily functions. It led me, he wrote a wonderful...
Described, as we might say, in the most specific detail.
Very specific detail, both his own and those of others. I mean, yes. I was directed back to read a little bit of a very small textbook that he wrote on the civilizing of children's manners. And I'll read this in the Tudor English translation from 1532. He's telling children how they ought to deal with trapped wind, because as Erasmus says, there is danger in holding the wind. And he writes, if thou may go apart, do that alone by thyself. If not, let the child close the fart under color of a cough. I mean, this is a sort of frankness that seems quite jarring to us today, where perhaps I think what you're implying at points in the biography is that actually we're rather more prudish today than Erasmus or his readers were about these kinds of things.
Yes, it is. It is odd to think of ourselves being a little more prudish, but it in places it seems that way. And to have in the correspondence letters sometimes to quite distinguished people describing his problems with his, an abscess being cut, and or his kidney stones, or he gives one description of giving birth to a kidney stone. It was just as bad as a woman's childbirth. And and I find it amazing that he was able to do as much as he did when you read all of that. He had terrible gout problems. He had dysentery. He was in the letter I examined the thing, it looks like he's just going on a trip on the Rhine, but in fact, it's describing how he got the plague and survived it. And that to me is it was a kind of a moral victory for him, I think, not just a physical victory. He was very, very aware of his own body and all of this, and very much interested in self-cures. He had many ideas of himself, and the obsession with wine that people know him for, which is quite remarkable, his sort of chasing down different varieties of wine, and his relationship with the town of Besançon, which he constantly was seeking for wine from. That really is, he can't drink beer. He has gout, and any gout sufferer, and I am one, knows that you cannot drink beer. And so I was quite interested in how his response to a lot of these things, and how people generally would have to, the lengths they would have to go in order to survive all the things that were happening then. Although we tend to talk about the lifespan of people back then as being very low, but in fact, if you made it past, your first 10 years or so, you're going to have like a much more kind of normal lifespan. So that the average has been drawn down by the early childhood deaths and so on.
Yeah. Yes, we should point out, of course, also that the reason the choice was between wine or beer was that if you drank water, you would probably get cholera.
Yes, that's the other. Yes, you don't want to drink that stuff.
You don't want to drink. Yeah, don't drink the water, as they say. But the way that Erasmus,
W.C. Fields, anyway.
Yes, the way that you talk about Erasmus's discussion of the body segues very nicely in the biography to the question of how his putting his body into his letters and his works, and it's always being a presence, is very similar to the way in which he put his persona, his learned persona, his intellectual persona, and represented that as a kind of personality in the works as well. Harking back to the phrase that we used before, you will see he is shown better, or you will see him better in his works.
No, I think the idea is to have a, with him is to have a very strong personal presence, and one of those things is to present the physical, and in a very realistic manner. He's not trying to conceal anything. There's no sense of this kind of a, and as you mentioned with the thing with the children, exactly what not to do and what to do in public places, and how to behave physically, and it had a moral quality to it too. So he was very concerned with his diet. He was he didn't really take much exercise, although he did early. He liked riding, and he was also, but mostly sort of walks in the garden, which in Basel there was a little garden that in the house that Froben had found for him, and but as it's a kind of a total presence that you have in the writing. To me, is it makes him so approachable by a modern reader, as well as an older, people from his own time.
I think for just to as we come to the end of this part of the evening, I think the fascinating counterbalance to Erasmus is this very strong, almost pungent presence in his own texts, is that he, of course, cultivated and was at the center of this vast network. On the one hand, the story is all about Erasmus, but on the other, he is at the center of what H.A. Mason, a critic, called a vast mutual admiration society. The reputations of all of these people, all of his friends, were partly founded on their appearance in his letters. And I think Erasmus really, you write about this again, Erasmus really invented to some degree, not the Republic of Letters. I mean, of course, learned correspondence had existed long before that, but he made it into something very much himself, and something crucially non-institutional.
Yes, I think that's the key thing. So from his earliest years, he seems to be moving away first from family, then from schools, then from monastic institution. Later on, when people ask him to do things, it's only for a short time, teaching at Cambridge or going to Louvain. He's not going to, people, when he became super famous, they were, people were writing, we'd like you to make you the bishop of something or other, and titular bishop of the whatever, and collect money from us and so on. He wasn't having any of that. There was even talk of a cardinal's hat for him. And he did not, he stayed outside of that. So family, and this is a period where corporate or I'd say community and corporate relations were essential for survival, really. Like your family connections, the institution, the guild that you belong to, all those things, the church, wherever, and demanded great loyalty from people too. Like and in his monastic vows, I mean, he never really escaped from his monastery in the end, even though he was allowed to keep all the money, go wherever he wanted to do, dress as he wished. He was still, in the end, he still had a monastic vow. People forget about that, but the vow was never completely eradicated. And so he had these, but that's what he fought against. And so instead you have this kind of creation of an ever expanding circle that starts early on. It's described in the Anti-Barbary, the Anti-Barbarians, where they have little conversations together, a small group of humanist friends, and it expands from school and so on. Then it expands and it expands. And suddenly you find people all over Europe being drawn into this. And there's a certain kind of attraction to Erasmus, not just the ideas and so on. There's something that's, I don't know, cool, I guess you could say, or whatever, that draws people into this. And to have a letter from Erasmus, be able to display a letter from Erasmus, people talked about that. One person even wrote him and asked him, could you just write me a letter? I haven't met you, I never will, but could you just write me a letter? So I have a letter from Erasmus. Yeah. So they were like collector's items, and they still would be if they were around, but now it's non-fungible tokens. But I think that you have this community, which in fact it's sort of built upon other communities, but it's also his community. I mean, it looks very convenient when you look at the letters. It's all been gathered together for you. And so it looks like it's all shaped and so on. But, there's humanist communities in all of these different towns, and some of them have connections with him, and that begins to draw other people in. And so in Nuremberg or Augsburg, or places like that, he gets to have a connection. And then there's the whole question of how he supported himself, which we haven't really looked at. And that to me is of great interest, because it was mainly by gifts. Early on, it was by kind of pensions and small amounts of money here and there that he earned. But later on, it was really and he died fairly wealthy. It was by accumulation of gifts, and quite substantial ones at times. So anyway, that to me is the idea of this group and the gathering together and all that is something that is remarkably pleasing for us to read about now, and also because it reflects on our own situation as scholars.